The Bent Pyramid. One of the most unusual and remarkable pyramids of ancient Egypt. How it was built? What's inside the structure of the Bent Pyramid? What secrets of ancient engineers and architects we can solve? How were ancient chambers of the Bent Pyramid built? How might ancient Egyptians have constructed the lower chamber of the Bent Pyramid? I will try to answer all these questions in this video. You will learn a lot of new things about ancient engineering and construction. We will deep together in ancient mysteries of pyramids. During the creation of my series on various structures, two stood out to me as anomalies, these being the Great Pits at Zawiet el Arian and Abu Rawash. These two sites, from the earliest days of Egyptology, have been classified as pyramid sites. However, during my research into these two sites, I concluded that the evidence that leads to such a classification is not wholly convincing and fails to explain several observations. These Great Pits have been used by several scholars to suggest how the lower chamber and passage may have been built at the Bent Pyramid. For example, Mark Lenner says, "All this building, plus a vertical shaft on the precise central axis of the pyramid, would have taken place in a trench sunk into the original desert surface." Frank Monnier and Alexander Pushkov also suggest a great pit and trench, and more recently Colin Reeder would say, "It is likely that the construction of the Bent Pyramid started with the excavation of a deep rock-cut trench, similar to the example we see at Abu Rawash. The above are just some of the many examples that all lead to the consensus that a great pit and trench exists also in the Bent Pyramid. But has the classification of the two great pit sites at Zawiet el Arian and Abu Rawash prejudiced our view of the Bent Pyramid? When one looks at most Egyptian structures, it appears that shafts and tunnels are the bread and butter of the Egyptian builders, not deep pits and trenches, like we see at the two great pit sites. It is informative to look at the constructions before and after the Bent Pyramid. Djoser's Step Pyramid. Various deep shafts. Main shaft with granite burial chamber about 90 feet deep, and very large network of extensive tunneling to create a labyrinth of passages, magazines, and galleries. Sekemket's Pyramid, extensive tunneling, small shaft, rock-cut chamber, galleries and magazines. Layer Pyramid of Zawiet el Arian, extensive tunneling, shafts, rock-cut chamber and magazines. Meidum Pyramid, lower chambers built in shallow open pit about 10 feet deep, upper chamber built approximately at ground level. Red Pyramid, chambers and passages built in superstructure. Tunnelers celebrate. Great Pyramid, most passages and chambers constructed in superstructure. Lower part of descending passage, lower part of well shaft, and unfinished subterranean chamber cut in the rock. Abu Rawash, large, deep to shaped pit, about 60 feet deep, and trench. Great Pit of Zawiet el Arian, large, deep to shaped pit, and trench, about 65 feet deep from the desert surface to the pavement floor, which extends to a depth of 14 feet. Total, therefore, 80 feet. Khafre's Pyramid, lower chamber and passages cut from the rock. Upper chamber walls cut in the rock to a depth of 17 feet. And horizontal passage, a mix of rock cutting and masonry. Menkaur's Pyramid, chambers rock cut, passages largely cut in the rock, other than when they extend into the superstructure. The Mastabot el Pharaon, chambers and passages built in shallow pit of unknown depth, though chamber floors about 23 feet below surface. In the following 5th and 6th dynasties, the small pyramids are similar to Mastabot el Pharaon in being built in shallow pits. In short, we have only the two great pit sites that share similar features. The majority of structures of the 3rd and 4th dynasty vary greatly in design, but are linked by extensive tunneling and cutting chambers out of the living rock. The above image shows the trench leading down to the pit at Zawiet el Arian. Here, if we accept that it is a pyramid, a huge amount of material must be removed. Passages and chambers would then be built and the whole lot backfilled. To me, this appears illogical, when tunneling and cutting chambers out of the rock would be more efficient and quicker. A large pit would also interfere with the superstructure construction. These pits would take some considerable time to create and backfill, whereas a rock-cut passage and chamber is of little concern to those tasked with building the superstructure, other than where the entrance passage goes through the masonry of the superstructure. Certainly, if we look at the Giza pyramids, This pit and trench technique does not seem to have been popular. We might ask why Khufu did not use it to create his subterranean chamber. Here a passage was cut through the rock of the plateau to a considerable depth, with the unfinished chamber cut from the rock. Though there is disagreement among Egyptology about the subterranean chamber, Lenner and Hawass suggest it was the last chamber to be built, others that it was an abandoned change of plan. Likewise, at Menkaura's pyramid, they could have elected to build the chambers in a pit, but instead they excavated them out of the rock, and with great skill, brought in large blocks of granite to case the burial chamber. Whatever the function of the two great pit sites, they appear short-lived. But are we correct in suggesting their use at the Bent Pyramid? In this video, I will suggest possibly not, and that the lower chamber and passage was constructed using shafts and tunneling. The pyramid built before the Bent Pyramid was the Meidum Pyramid, so we need to look at the construction of this pyramid to find clues in how they may have constructed the lower chambers of the Bent. The Bent Pyramid is poorly explored, so I'm grateful to Isida Project and Colin Reeder for the use of their images. Ultimately, only so much can be deduced from images, and hopefully some future exploration can determine the true makeup of the Bent Pyramid's lower chambers. It's important to say a few words about Meidum Pyramid before anything else. The Meidum Pyramid consists of two small chambers built in a shallow pit cut in the rock, whereas the main burial chamber is built on top of the rock. The upper chamber is corbelled to relieve the weight from the superstructure. The lower chambers are also relieved by corbelling, though these cannot be seen, due to the horizontal ceiling beams. The following image should hopefully clarify things. In this rough section of the Meidum chambers, it is thought that the two small lower chambers are masonry constructions, built in a shallow rectangular pit. The larger burial chamber is constructed on top of the natural rock and is accessed through a vertical shaft. The distance between the upper and lower pavements is about 20 feet. There might be some important symbolic reason why some chambers were to be placed below ground and some above. In this image, looking towards the south wall of the burial chamber, you can see some of the surviving pavement resting on the natural rock. Note also the small breach at the bottom of the south wall. Here, you can see that chamber floor has been cut down a further 3 feet, and that tiles adhere to the natural rock. In this closer image, you can see masonry lying on top of the natural rock, and where the floor has been lowered, this natural rock feature was covered by thick tiling. This tiling feature can also be found in the vertical shaft, and as you will see, this tiling feature can be found in the lower chambers of the Bent Pyramid. In this view, looking up the south wall of the vertical shaft, one can quite clearly make out the natural rock present on the south, east, and west sides of the shaft. At the top of the south wall, one can make out some small residual tiling and, tiling adhering to the west wall. The wooden beams I have suggested were to hold a vertical portcullis. Looking down the vertical shaft, you can see surviving tiling on the west and east walls, with the north wall constructed out of masonry. It is not to be excluded that thick tiling or lining is to be found in some areas of the lower chambers. The pit need not be a perfect rectangle, but could roughly follow the contour of the chambers, utilizing the natural rock as part of the construction. This tiling that you see suggests clever economy in rock cutting. Cutting through natural rock is arduous enough, without unnecessary further cutting. This economy of rock is clearly absent in the two great pit sites, and further calls into question their function as pyramid sites. Now let's take a look inside the Bent Pyramid. The lower chambers of the Bent Pyramid are at a considerable depth in the rock, with the floor of the antechamber at about 70 feet below base. This depth being similar to the two great pit sites, which is probably why the pit and trench method has been suggested for the Bent as well. I have a section and plan of the lower chambers by Maragioglio and Rinaldi. The descending passage enters the antechamber, which maintains the same width as the descending passage. The antechamber soars to a height of around 40 feet and has a corbelled ceiling. You can see highlighted the lower chambers. The natural rock floor of the lower chamber is about 23 feet above the antechamber floor, or some 50 feet below base. The picture gives a rough idea of the lower chamber's layout. Those interested in more detail on the above, in this image, you can see the natural rock wall, which is the south wall of the antechamber. Today, these old steps have been replaced by more modern solid steps, which prevent us from viewing this wall. Here you see a similar economy of rock excavation, like we see at Meidum. No evidence of the large pit floors seen at the Great Pit sites, or the deep masonry floors like at Zawiet, made of monolithic blocks to a depth of some 15 feet. Like at Meidum, the images also suggest that the east and west walls of the antechamber are also tiled. In the image, we appear to see some natural rock visible on the east wall of the antechamber, and possible missing tiling. Note modern stairs. In this image, we appear to have some mortar adhering to the surface. Obviously, only so much can be deduced from images. A thorough examination of these chambers is really needed. However, the tiling of the vertical shaft at Meidum suggests that the tiling of the antechamber walls is a distinct possibility. The tiling of the antechamber walls may have been done with tiles of variable thickness, with deeper recesses cut in the natural rock walls to receive them. The height of the antechamber walls is considerable, so they may have wished to provide extra support to the tiles. You can see a closer view of the better preserved parts of the antechamber wall. Above, looking down at the north wall, the impression is that we have deteriorated fine white tiles adhering to the east and west walls. Beyond these, the remainder of the east and west walls appear homogeneous with the north wall. The construction of the north wall is hard to determine from the available images, though where the corbelling commences on the antechamber, the north wall appears to be of masonry. If trenched like the two great pit sites, we should expect the north wall to be made of masonry. However, if the entire north wall is of masonry, it may not indicate a trench, but instead a function of how the descending passage joins the antechamber, which I will describe later. The following images highlight more of the antechamber north wall. This image is slightly further up the north wall, and again the deterioration makes it difficult to ascertain its makeup. Slightly further up the north wall, we appear to see some masonry lines. When I zoom in on these, on the high-resolution image, some appear less convincing. In the next image, we have another view of this area that shows what appears to be a horizontal joint in the image above to be not so horizontal, though neat masonry blocks do seem to appear next to the masonry corbels. In this view from a different angle and camera, you can see what appears to be a horizontal joint line in the previous image appear to be curved in the view above. Again, we appear to have neat masonry blocks coinciding with the start of the masonry corbels. Clearly, a long ladder and a closer examination of the north wall are required. The corbelled ceiling of the antechamber, neat masonry on the top of the north wall, appears to coincide with the masonry corbels. It might be the case that the antechamber is a deep shaft, which may have been tiled on all four walls, leaving the natural rock to bear the load of the corbelled ceiling. The southern rock wall may have been tiled, but removed by robbers in their searches, as we have a sizable excavation at the base of this wall. The corbelled ceiling in the antechamber has a shallow projection compared to the larger lower chamber, the corbels projecting only a palm in the antechamber compared to 2 palms in the lower chamber. Let's go deeper to the lower chamber. The larger lower chamber appears to have a strange mix of construction. Here we have evidence also of sizable tiles. This view of the south wall, next to the chimney entrance, clearly shows tiles adhering to the south wall. In this view, we get an idea of the thickness of the tiles. What the tiles adhere to is not clear. In a large chamber like this, they may have used the natural rock, but in some areas, such as doorways, the chimney, etc., they may have elected to build with masonry blocks. So we could have a mix. The chamber's east wall to the left is quite well preserved and could be tiled with similar tiles that we see on the south wall. Close-up view of the southern wall tiles. The west wall exhibits some damage, as shown by the above images, but again it is hard to deduce much from the images. It is possible that the south, east, and west walls are similarly tiled, but to what is not known. For example, the chamber may have been constructed in a shaft, lined with masonry, and then tiled with fine white limestone, or a mix of masonry and natural rock. Certainly some of the images suggest masonry, as the quality of the limestone that the tiles adhere to appears of a better quality than we see in the antechamber. That said, the quality of rock can vary greatly as they cut through the strata. At Zawiet, one can see a smooth patch repair on the west wall of the trench. Where we have a layer of poor quality rock, the north wall is a curious construction. A noticeable line is to be seen running down the wall. This line appears to be a white plaster finish, as the next image shows. Picture what appears to be a fine layer of white plaster applied to the masonry of the north wall. In this image of the north wall, we can make out the masonry joints of the north wall. The thickness of the wall is 1 cubit. The entrance has been enlarged, and we can see some of the corbels belonging to the antechamber behind this wall. The first corbel that protrudes 2 palms can be seen above the entrance. And strangely, we appear to have some thin tiles adhering to the wall beneath the first corbel. To the right, we might have damage to possible tiles of the east wall. This chamber has had modifications done to it. By who and when is not known. For example, the excavation made into the south wall of the antechamber, if done by robbers, could suggest that the pyramid was violated before the masonry staircase was built in the antechamber. It is cautious not to assume that everything we see in the structure is contemporary to the original build. How the lower chambers were built and how they used the natural rock to best effect an economy of excavation will require a thorough exploration of the lower chambers. But given what appears to be sensible economy of rock in the antechamber, it would appear illogical to create a huge trench in order to create the descending passage. So how might they have created the descending passage, if not by trenching? The rock on which the pyramid sits would appear to be good quality. Indeed, the quarries that provided the core for the pyramid are barely a stone's throw away. We might ask that if the stone is good enough to build the pyramid, surely it's good enough to safely protect a tunnel. I therefore suggest that the builders could have tunneled through the natural rock and lined the tunnel with fine limestone to blend with the masonry-built part of the descending passage. If we assume that the rock starts at 9 feet below desert surface, we could have a tunnel some 150 feet long that would require excavation. So how might such a tunnel look like? In the image, we are looking down the short descending passage in Queen Khentka's tomb at Giza. Here they cut a tunnel out of the natural rock and lined it with granite blocks. The roofing stones have long disappeared. This tunnel is roughly 8 feet wide by 6 feet high. The floor stones rest on the rock, with the walls resting on the floor stones. When lined, the passage reduces to roughly 3 feet wide by 3 feet high. In the bent pyramid passage, the built passage appears to be 2 cubits wide by 2 cubits high. However, the 1 cubit thick floor stones are inserted between the walls, and hence the height of the passage, minus paving, is 3 cubits. The wall stones at Khentka's are about 2 feet thick. If we allow the same for the roofing stones and use this example at the bent, we would need a tunnel 8 feet wide by 7 feet high. Such a tunnel some 150 feet long would require the removal of some 7,047 cubic feet of rock, or about 1/10 of the amount of material required by an open trench to the north wall of the antechamber. Such a tunnel is not cramped and can allow several workers to go about their work. At the Great Pit of Zawiet, the width of the trench was some 18 feet. Building a descending passage in an open trench also requires more work. The large amount of masonry backfill would probably necessitate that the passage was relieved of this weight by corbelling above the passage. Tunneling, by comparison, does not require this added work, as the passage is protected by the natural rock. A tunnel some 150 feet long is surely feasible and simple to achieve. One only has to look at the miles of it under the step pyramid to see how efficient they were at doing this kind of work. The greater part of the north descending passage is built of 2 wall courses, total 3 cubits perpendicular height. The paving stones are inserted between the walls and are 1 cubit thick, and therefore reducing the bore of the passage to a square of 2 cubits. In the better preserved north end of the descending passage, we can just about make out the joint lines between the 2 courses. This method of construction using 2 courses does not extend for the whole length of the descending passage, as some 40 feet from the entrance is constructed of large single wall blocks. In this impression, you see the junction between different wall-type constructions. This junction with a noticeable drop in the ceiling is often explained as settlement along an abandoned 60-degree pyramid. From this junction, we have approximately 60 feet of the passage that would be constructed out of masonry in the superstructure of the pyramid before we get to the natural bedrock and commencement of the tunnel. However, we would also likely have a short further stage, a sort of hybrid between the masonry and tunnel constructions. Depending on the quality of rock, The builders of the tunnel would ensure they had a sufficient depth of rock to protect the start of their tunnel, so we would likely have a short passage created in a trench, sandwiched between the lined tunnel and the superstructure part of the passage. This then provides us with 4 possible distinct constructions that make up the descending passage. In this image, showing the bottom of the descending passage, you can still just about make out the joint lines between courses. Here we see extensive deterioration of the passage, not unlike what we see at Meidum. In the many images I have seen of the lower parts of the descending passage, though we have extensive deterioration, the joints of the masonry all appear to be quite tight, whereas in the upper parts, we often see opening of the masonry joints in the area that coincides with the superstructure section. The superstructure section would be more liable to movement if the surrounding core masonry was not closely fitted. We also must bear in mind the extreme age of the pyramid, some 4,500 years old, and the effect of unknown seismic activity in its past. The Cairo earthquake of 1992, which caused extensive damage and fatalities, had its epicenter at Dahshur. When one looks at the extensive deterioration of the ceiling blocks, one wonders why they have not collapsed, especially if they were built in an open trench and backfilled without relieving corbelling. If they have been inserted in a tunnel, there will be no superincumbent masonry weighing down on the ceiling blocks. Another unusual feature noticed by M.R. is the following, they say. Along the upper edge of the side walls, it is possible to note that the ceiling blocks are placed like the teeth of a saw. This fact, which is seldom apparent in the lower part of the corridor, becomes almost a rule in the upper part. Due to the good state of preservation of the ceiling, we were able to notice that the wall blocks were intentionally cut in the upper part in order to receive the ceiling slabs, and that the indentation of the saw teeth varies from 2 to 4 centimeters. In the lower part of the corridor, the joints are very thin, while in the upper part, they are wider, and several of them are open. Moreover, in correspondence with the lower apex of the saw teeth, the walls have numerous cracks, and this confirms that a sensible settlement took place in the pyramid masonry. Example of Sawtooth ceiling block. On the previous page are further examples of this sawtooth feature. Unfortunately for us, M.R. do not indicate on their drawings where exactly this feature starts. In the 150-odd images the Osiris project kindly sent me of the north descending passage, it appears that this sawtooth feature coincides more with the subterranean section of the passage. The view above does not appear to show any sawtooth features. They appear to be only visible in the close-fitting subterranean section of the descending passage. M.R.'s comment. Moreover, in correspondence with the lower apex of the saw teeth, the walls have numerous cracks. I have not been able to confirm on the images available to me this observation. Though on the superstructure section of the passage, cracks are visible, it is not altogether clear if these are sawtooth features, as shown in the next image. In the superstructure section of the passage, there are several examples of the above, though it appears not to be a sawtooth feature, as the ceiling line appears aligned. M.R. may have assumed such features were related to sawtooth features. Certainly, in the west passage, they appear to have drawn features that do not show up on the photographs. The sawtooth feature does not appear on the upper section of the passage, which is made of large single blocks. If these sawtooth ceiling blocks only appear to be in the subterranean section of the passage, they may be indicative of a tunnel construction. The builders may have been concerned of cumulative sliding forces of the ceiling stones if they were all laid flat on top of the wall course. Keying the ceiling stones into the upper course would dissipate such forces. The wall courses themselves would likewise be keyed into the sides of the tunnel. At some intervals, thicker wall course stones could be inserted into deeper recesses of the tunnel. The lower wall course blocks may even have varied in height to fit into deeper recesses cut into the tunnel floor. Likewise, the paving stones inserted between the walls could have varied in thickness to fit into recesses left on the tunnel floor. These are just examples of how the builders could have adapted their masonry if they were concerned about cumulative sliding forces of the masonry throughout this lengthy part of the passage of approximately 150 feet. Such concerns would not be so much of an issue in the superstructure section of the passage, where the passage masonry can easily be keyed into the surrounding core masonry. Having made the tunnel down to the shaft of the antechamber, how might they have lined this tunnel? Working from the bottom, The lower wall core stones can be slid down the tunnel and into position. The second core stones could have been placed on a sledge with a raised platform, such that the stone just requires sliding onto the lower course. A similar raised platform could be used to insert the ceiling stones to their saw-toothed notches, let into the upper wall course. Finally, the paving stones would be inserted between the walls of the passage. Such a construction in a tunnel would be more efficient and quicker than the massive amount of work required in excavating a huge trench and pit, such as we see at the two great pit sites. Certainly, if I was tasked with the job, I know which method I would prefer. It should be relatively easy to confirm. If the passage is built in a tunnel, small holes could be drilled in the ceiling, and cameras inserted much like Dormion and Verdhert have done at the Meidum pyramid. Indeed, it may not be required, as some holes exist in the deteriorated ceiling that might be utilized, as shown in the image on the next page. If a tunnel exists, we need to discuss how it joined with the antechamber. When it comes to the junction of the descending passage with the antechamber, there are a few scenarios that I can imagine. For example, if a tunnel exists and the north wall of the antechamber is made of masonry, how could such observations be explained? Depending on the quality of natural rock at this location, they may have wished for better quality and stronger masonry blocks at this junction. So instead of a rectangular shaft that roughly followed the outline of the antechamber being sunk, they may have elected to cut a T-shaped shaft with masonry blocks lowered into the top of our T and sandwiched between the natural rock. Above we have a rough outline of the four possible sections of the descending passage. Tunnel section, the largest section of the passage and quite deteriorated, though the joints are very close, and where the sawtooth feature appears quite prevalent. Trench section, a short hybrid section, partly built in a rock trench and roofed with superstructure masonry. Superstructure section, built in core masonry. In this section we have fractures and openings of the joints. Casing section, well constructed and built of large single wall blocks, as opposed to the two courses that run throughout the rest of the descending passage. Though it's often reported that the bent pyramid is built on the desert surface, I feel that this is an unlikely event. Wainwright's tunnel at the Meidum pyramid shows how the builders took care to scrape down and anchor the step pyramid onto the natural rock. Only the later casing phase was founded on a platform on the desert surface, with the steps of the tower carrying most of the load of the casing. I have opted for a stepped core instead of a 60-degree pyramid. For more detail on this, please read my previous papers on the bent pyramid point 9. Where the natural rock surface begins under the desert surface at the bent pyramid is not known with any certainty. For the purposes of this exercise, I have placed it at 2.5 m below, which would place the height of the first step at about 8.5 m above rock. Step heights can vary significantly, as shown by Petrie's survey at Meidum and his drawing below. In the image, we see Petrie draw the passage exiting on top of a step, which I have replicated in my previous image. This would appear to be a logical choice, as the top of the step provides a useful working platform around the entrance. A similar design may have been a feature of the bent pyramid. Moreover, it allows the end of the casing section to be firmly anchored and supported by the step. At the junction of the casing and superstructure sections, a noticeable drop is evident. This is always explained as settlement, though when Petrie first examined it, he came to a different conclusion. He says, "This formation is not due to settlement, for a settlement of 11 inches in such solid masonry, not far from the ground, is impossible. The more so, as it would need a uniform settlement of the whole of the lower part of the passage, which should quickly cease at one point, and soon after continue at an equal amount. And because the roof on the upper side of the dislocation is cut away in a slope for 23 inches, 1.1 being removed at a maximum, this shows that the builders were well aware of this formation in their time, and yet that they did not wish to smooth it all out, as if it were an accident or settlement, though nothing would have been easier for them than to have removed all trace of it. This part, like the rest of this pyramid, needs far more examination. Given the large masonry blocks and casing that constitute the casing phase onto the step structure, and especially if the end of the passage is further supported by a step founded on the bedrock, I would tend to agree with Petrie. Indeed, when one looks at the images of the casing section, One is struck by the straightness of this section. It is as if the whole passage has conveniently pivoted about the entrance, an extremely unlikely event in such solid masonry. In the sequence of images looking down the casing section of the passage to the superstructure section, we can see how remarkably straight the passage is by looking at the ceiling lines. This straightness of the passage appears maintained up to the entrance of the pyramid. Indeed, if one had a 40 feet straight edge and run it along the ceiling, would we find any deviation? Given that we are told that a sizable settlement of some 11 inches has occurred, should we not have more evidence of breaks and settlements along this section? In this view, looking up the casing section towards the entrance, we again see how the passage maintains its straightness along its length. I have suggested that this feature was purposely built this way. For example, it may have been intended to plug this section as security. The Meidum subsidiary pyramid has a arch step in its floor to restrain plugging stones, as to do the great western tombs at Meidum. We do not know the extent of any movement or issues the builders may have had with the superstructure section of the passage at the time of construction. At some 4,500 years old, and untold earthquakes under its belt, what we see today does not necessarily reflect what the builders had to contend with. But if there were issues at their time that caused movement in the superstructure section, which prevented it from being successfully plugged, they may have elected to adjust the casing section with the intent of only plugging that section. Petrie is surely right when he says it needs more examination. Also to be considered are the time frames when these sections were built. The casing phase of the step pyramid would be many years away from the superstructure section. During this time, improvements and processes involved in construction continually evolve and problems solved. In the image, the viewer would be forgiven for thinking that it was an image of one of the red pyramid's chambers. It is in fact an image of the bent pyramid's subsidiary pyramid and highlights the continuing improvement in masonry. When the bent pyramid was first started, the construction of the core may have more in common with what we see at Meidum. Petrie would say of Meidum, the inner masonry within each of the finished faces is very rough. No attempt has been made to fit the blocks, except by selecting chance adjustments. The courses are approximately equal, but a coarse mortar is largely used to fill the hollows that are left. The view above is from the Meidum pyramid and gives an indication of the masonry quality. Would they have carried this quality over to the initial phase of the bent pyramid? If the superstructure section was built within such masonry, it might explain the movement visible in this section. The masonry is often criticized at the Meidum and the bent. Yet even such fine pyramids as the Giza giants are not as well built as many suppose. Excavations made into these structures often highlight rough masonry. M.R. on reporting on the robbers' tunnel in Khafre's pyramid state, it was probably enlarged later when it was cleared of rubble, as Belzoni had to do when he made his first attempt to enter the monument. In fact, the Italian explorer found the tunnel had collapsed at several points, and he himself caused not a few falls when he removed the fallen blocks. This was without doubt due to the incompactness of the internal masonry and the lack of mortar, so that the blocks are not always in contact at the sides and cannot mutually support each other as happens in a vault. This observation can be easily extended to the entire nucleus of the pyramid and seems to prove that, while the outer part of every course of the nucleus is regular and formed of squared blocks, the inner part consists of a filling made of very roughly shaped blocks, with large joints, devoid of mortar. In the picture, we have a closer look at the junction of the two sections. In both walls, we have sizable voids, just in front of the junction face. When these voids were created is not known, but given the unusual layout of this junction and change of masonry, from two wall courses to one, it would not have escaped the attention of violators, who may have decided to excavate into this junction in the hope of some find. If such excavation took place, it would undermine support to the surrounding masonry, allowing fractures to propagate and opening of masonry joints. Looking into the voids of the west wall and below east wall, in the impression I have restored how the original junction may have looked like. I have removed the cubit-high paving from the passage for clarity, as it would obscure the protuberance. These protuberances were noticed by M.R. and appeared to be no higher than the inserted paving stones. The impression based on M, Rs tab 11, also shows a step in the ceiling and floor of about 3 inches further south of the junction. In a recent article by Colin Reeder, he mentions this area. He says, "Further evidence for movement in the northern passage occurs a short distance, downslope of the major dislocation, where there is an 8 centimeters step in the ceiling. A lack of movement of the joints in the adjacent passage walls indicates that this smaller step is unlikely to be the result of settlement, however. The joints between the ceiling's blocks at this position have widened by approximately 2 centimeters, allowing glimpses of the masonry above. This appears at odds with MR's report, where they appear to conclude settlement. They say, in the north descending corridor, we saw that A. There are 2 sinkings. The first is 23 centimeters, while the second one is 8 centimeters. If the system had been intentional, the second would not have been made because it would have been useless. B. The connection in the ceiling, obtained by cutting away a maximum thickness of 3 centimeters, demonstrates that this was the entity of the settling during the building of the pyramid. If the entity had been greater, the cutting too would have been deeper. Moreover, there is no trace of a connecting cut in the ceiling in correspondence of the lesser dislocation, the 8 centimeters one. M.R. would go on to suggest that a small sliding of the masonry may have occurred during the build, with the more important sliding possibly occurring many years after the closing of the pyramid. Looking up the passage to the junction, the 23 centimeters disparity in ceiling blocks is visible. However, the 8 centimeters step is questionable and could simply be an artifact left by degradation of the ceiling stone next to it. The image also seems to confirm Reader's observation that such settlement is not reflected in the wall courses. The images also suggest that the ceiling line is fairly straight. In short, the 8 centimeters settlement is called into question as to whether it even exists. Above we have M.R.'s drawing of the junction, and I have highlighted the protuberance and 8 centimeters settlement that they show on the floor and ceiling. Today, we are unable to validate whether this drop in the floor exists due to the wooden boards. Pyramids are not nice environments to work in. They can be hot, and in places, movement is restricted. How long M.R. had to examine this area is not known. They may have taken notes and relied on memory to formulate their impressions at a later date. Their work consists of large plan drawings, and photography is absent from their work. It is therefore possible that errors can be made in the creation of their drawings. Another questionable settlement drawn by M.R. is related to the western corridor of the bent pyramid. Here they report, in correspondence to the fracture, there is a dislocation very similar to the one we noted in the north corridor. But here, the sinking is only 5 centimeters. This fracture is east of the continuous joint in this corridor. As in the north passage, M.R. have drawn a step in the floor. However, images of the area in question show the floor to be clearly smooth. Here we can see that the floor is clearly smooth. For orientation, note the square holes in the wall. The lower image shows the square hole in the top left corner. Note also how the joint line of the 2 wall courses appears level throughout this area. Further, like the 8 centimeters settlement that they highlight in the north passage, is this just another artifact created by the degradation of the ceiling stone next to it? Clearly, a more detailed forensic analysis is required of these areas in order to establish the true masonry makeup. From the evidence available to me as a layman, I have to conclude that Petrie's original observation that the north passage is not due to settlement is still a valid hypothesis. In Colin Reeder's Article 17, he observed how the masonry around the entrance to the north passage had been cut in a particular manner. In the somewhat distorted view above, we can see the large lintel that protects the entrance, and either side of that, we find masonry whose lower edge has been cut at an angle. This masonry then levels out and maintains a constant height throughout the remainder of the pyramid course, which is a lesser height than the lintel above the door. In the view above, we can see how the masonry has been cut at an oblique angle and then becomes horizontal for the rest of the course. Colin Reeder would suggest the thicker casing block over the northern entrance and the adjacent blocks all appear to have been cut to accommodate the dropped outer ceiling of the northern entrance. However, there may be another explanation for this feature, and that is simple economy of rock and the task of casing the pyramid. According to M.R.'s drawing, this lintel is some 5 feet high by 10 feet wide. Depth not recorded. If I allow a depth of 3 feet, we could be looking at 4.5 cubic meters of lintel, or about 12 metric tons. It may be more, as Petrie would comment that the casing blocks tended to be very deep from back to front. Some that were only 20 inches high and about 60 inches wide would extend back about 80 inches. It would appear beneficial, therefore, that such casing blocks be kept to a manageable size. The massive lintel has a job of protecting the void beneath it. Such large blocks would be uneconomical to continue around the whole course of the pyramid. They could lighten their workload in casing the pyramid by reducing this course to more manageable proportions. Let's make some concluding remarks. Whatever the method of construction for the lower chambers and passage, be it like the 2 great pit sites or shafts and tunnels as I suggest in this paper, it is quite clear that an immense amount of exploration is still required at the bent pyramid. Too much certainty has been written about this structure, be it 60-degree pyramids, settlement, changes of plans, etc., and all based on a poorly explored structure. Surely, we owe it to the great Egyptian builders to thoroughly explore their immense efforts. But as I have said many times in previous guides, architectural study is a low priority for Egyptology, and it's hard to see how this state of affairs can improve. Thankfully, our knowledge of the bent pyramid is slowly beginning to improve, thanks to the good work of the Isida Project and others, such as Colin Reeder, who has been fortunate to look inside. Though much work remains to be done. Over 130 years ago, Petrie would comment, "This part, like the rest of this pyramid, needs far more examination. Hopefully, we will not have to wait a further century before this examination begins." I made this video based on Keith Hamilton's great article. You can find a link in the description. Keith made the great job writing his series of guides.